Chapter 1: The Anatomy of a Secret. The bell above the door of the Vellum Vault didn't ring so much as it sighed. It was a heavy, brass thing from the 1920s, and it announced visitors with a reluctant chime that suited the shop's dim, subterranean atmosphere. Elias Thorne did not look up. He was currently performing what he called paper surgery. With a pair of fine-tipped tweezers and a touch of wheat starch paste, he was mending a tear in a 1790 edition of Lyrical Ballads. To anyone else, it was a book. To Elias, it was a patient. He lived his life in the quiet margins of history, preferring the predictable scent of old glue and goatskin leather to the unpredictable noise of the London streets 3 steps above his ceiling. He was reaching for a bone folder when he noticed the anomaly. Tucked deep into the gutter of the binding was a series of papers. They weren't the usual pressed flowers or forgotten receipts. They were thick, high-quality watercolor sheets, folded into precise squares. Elias paused. His pulse, usually as steady as a metronome, gave a singular traitorous hop. He set down his tools and gingerly extracted the first square. It wasn't aged. The paper was fresh, smelling faintly of linseed oil and something sharp, citrus perhaps. He unfolded it. There was no salutation, only a confession written in a hand that seemed to be fighting against the constraints of the page. May 14th. The sun hit the Thames at 6:02 p.m. It wasn't gold. It was the color of a peach that's been left on the counter 2 days too long, vibrant, bruised, and on the verge of disappearing. I'm writing this down because the doctor says the peripherals are the first to go. If I can't see the edges of the world soon, I need to know they were there. Elias stared at the ink. It was a deep, shimmering indigo. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of voyeurism. This wasn't a bookmark, it was a map of a disappearing world. Hello. Is anyone down here? It's like a tomb in this place. The voice was a jagged bolt of lightning in his quiet cellar. Elias jumped, nearly knocking over his jar of distilled water. He quickly slid the paper under his leather desk blotter, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. A woman was descending the narrow wooden stairs. She didn't walk so much as she tumbled into the room, her movements graceful but strangely hesitant. She wore a mustard yellow coat that had seen better decades and a pair of oversized, round glasses that obscured half her face. "We're closed for private restoration," Elias said, his voice sounding rustier than usual. "I know. I saw the sign. I ignored it," she said, reaching the bottom step. She stopped and tilted her head, her eyes scanning the room not by looking directly at things, but by turning her head in slight, searching arcs. "I'm looking for a book. I sold it here 3 days ago when I was having a very dramatic Tuesday and needed rent money. But I've realized I left my brain inside it." Elias stood up, adjusting his sleeves. "A lot of people leave their brains in books, Miss Clara Vance." She stepped closer, her boots clicking on the stone floor. She stopped just a foot away from his workbench, her gaze landing somewhere near his left shoulder. "It's a Byron collection. Green cloth. Smells like a damp library and regret." Elias looked at the Byron sitting on his desk. "The book containing the rest of those indigo ink secrets?" "I have it," Elias said slowly. He looked at her, really looked at her. Up close he could see the faint smears of paint on her cuticles and a streak of turquoise behind her ear. She was vibrant, messy, and lived in a world of light, while he lived in a world of shadows. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, reaching out. Her hand swiped the air inches above the book. She corrected herself quickly, her fingers brushing the leather, but the mist beat didn't escape him. Elias didn't hand it over. He found himself gripped by a sudden, inexplicable urge to keep the connection open. "I'm afraid I've already begun the deacidification process. The pages are unstable. If you take it now, the ink might react with the oxygen. It needs to stay in the press for at least 48 hours. It was a blatant lie. A professional sin. Clara bit her lip, looking crestfallen. 48 hours. But I need there are notes. In the back. Private ones. They'll be safe, Elias promised, his voice softening. "I'm a restorer, Miss Vance. My entire life is built on the sanctity of the page. I don't lose things. And I certainly don't destroy them." Clara seemed to deflate, her shoulders dropping. She looked around the shop again, that strange sweeping gaze lingering on the warm glow of his lamp. "It's so dark in here," she whispered almost to herself. "How do you see anything?" "I've spent so long in the dark that I've learned to see with my hands," Elias replied. She smiled, then a small, lopsided thing that made the air in the small shop feel suddenly very thin. "Well, Mr. Librarian, I suppose my secrets are in your hands then. Don't go reading them. They aren't meant for an audience." "I wouldn't dream of it," Elias said, the lie tasting like copper on his tongue. As she turned to leave, navigating the stairs with a careful hand on the railing, Elias reached under the blotter and touched the cream-colored paper. He knew he should give them back. He knew he should be honest. But as the door chimed and the silence returned, Elias realized he wasn't ready to let go of the girl who saw the sky as a bruised peach. Chapter 2: The Chromatography of Fear. The silence that followed Clara's departure was heavier than usual. It pressed against Elias's eardrums, echoing with the rhythm of her retreating footsteps. For a long minute, he simply stood there, his hand still resting on the Byron, as if it were a pulse point. He knew the ethical line. He had walked it for 15 years. A restorer was a ghost, a silent observer who mended the vessel, but never interfered with the spirit. But the letter under his blotter wasn't 200 years old. The ink was so fresh he could almost imagine the friction of the pen that had laid it down. Elias sat back down, the springs of his chair groaning. With a guilt that felt like a physical weight, he pulled the remaining 3 slips of paper from the book spine. He spread them out on the black velvet of his workstation. Under the magnifying lamp, the indigo ink didn't just look like writing, it looked like a topographical map of a woman's soul. June 2nd. The peripheral blurring is moving inward, like a vignette on an old photograph. "Today, I tried to paint the poppies in the square, but I couldn't find the red. Not the real red. I had to guess by the labels on the tubes. If I lose the red, I lose the heart of everything. Is this what it feels like to be erased?" Elias felt a cold shiver. He looked around his shop, his sanctuary of shadows. He had chosen the dimness. He had curated a life where light was the enemy of his materials. But for Clara, the light was a fleeing lover, slipping out the door while she slept. The next note was shorter, the handwriting more erratic. "I saw a man today in a suit the color of a rainy Tuesday. He looked so solid, so permanent. I wanted to grab him and ask him to describe the clouds to me, just to see if we were seeing the same sky. I didn't. I just bought a coffee I couldn't afford and cried into the phone." Elias looked down at his own sleeve. Dark charcoal wool. A suit the color of a rainy Tuesday. A sudden, jarring realization struck him. The man in the suit was him. She had written this after her first visit to the shop to sell the book. While he had been evaluating the grain of the leather, she had been mourning the clouds. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the back room of the shop, a small apartment that smelled of tea and old paper. He spent the hours researching retinitis pigmentosa and other degenerative conditions. He watched videos of how the world looks when it begins to narrow, the tunnel vision, the loss of low light clarity. By 4 a.m., he wasn't just a restorer anymore. He was a man possessed by a singular, frantic purpose. He returned to his workbench. He didn't work on the Byron. Instead, he pulled out a drawer of rare pigments he used for illuminating manuscripts. He found a jar of lapis lazuli, a small vial of cinnabar, and a packet of gold leaf. He began to write. Not a letter, he wasn't that bold, but a guide. When the bell sighed at 10 a.m. the following morning, Elias was ready. He hadn't shaved, and his eyes were rimmed with red, but he stood straight as Clara navigated the stairs. She was wearing a bright, almost aggressive orange scarf today. A defiant splash of color against the gloom. "Is the patient ready for discharge?" she asked, her voice trying for a lightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. She reached for the counter, her hand trailing along the wood until she found the edge. "The book is stable," Elias said, his voice low. He pushed the green volume toward her, but he placed a small, heavy object on top of it. Clara's fingers found the book, then drifted over the object. "What's this?" "It's a jeweler's loupe," Elias explained. "And inside the back cover, you'll find I've added a few supplemental pages. Archival quality, of course." Clara frowned, her brow furrowing behind her glasses. She opened the book to the back. Her breath hitched. Elias had spent the night creating a color registry. He had used his purest pigments to create thick, textured swatches of every primary and secondary color. Next to each one, he had used a braille embosser, a tool he usually used for labeling rare collections, to punch the names of the colors into the paper. Red, blue, gold. But he hadn't stopped there. Below the tactile names he had written descriptions in large, high-contrast black ink. Ultramarine, the sound of a deep bell. The temperature of the ocean at midnight. The weight of a secret kept too long. Clara's fingers hovered over the textured paint. She felt the raised bumps of the braille, then the thick, dried impasto of the pigment. "You read them?" she whispered. It wasn't an accusation, it was a realization. "I'm a restorer," Clara Elias said, stepping around the counter for the first time. He was close enough to see the way her pupils didn't quite react to the lamp. "I couldn't let the colors fade. Not on my watch." Clara looked up. She couldn't see the expression in his eyes, but she could hear the tremble in his voice. For the first time, she didn't look like she was fading. She looked like she was catching fire. "It's not enough to know what they're called," she said, a single tear escaping the rim of her glasses. "I'm losing the way they move." Elias took a breath, stepping into the light of the front window. "Then let's go find them. While the sun is still high." Chapter 3, The Light in the Frame. The National Gallery was a cathedral of light and limestone, a stark contrast to the velvet claustrophobia of the Vellum Vault. As they climbed the grand staircase, Elias felt a strange vulnerability. Out here, without his workbench and his magnifying glass, he was just a man in a charcoal suit, hyper-aware of the woman whose elbow was lightly, tentatively linked with his. Clara moved with a studied grace, her head held high as if she were daring the world to blur. But Elias noticed the way her grip tightened whenever they moved from a bright hall into a shadow-drenched corridor. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice hushed by the vastness of the room. "Room 34, Elias murmured. "Great Britain, 1750 to 1850. You said you were losing the way colors move. I thought we should start with someone who didn't just paint light, but captured its pulse." He led her to a massive canvas. It was Turner's The Fighting Temeraire. "Describe it," Clara whispered. She stepped closer, her nose inches from the velvet rope, her eyes darting across the canvas in that frantic, searching zigzag. "Don't give me the brochure version, Elias. Tell me what's happening in the air." Elias took a breath. He had spent his life looking at the physical makeup of art, the weave of the linen, the chemical stability of the lead white, but for her, he looked at the ghosts. "The sky is dying," Elias began. "But it's going out in a fit of rage. On the right, there's a sunset that looks like an open wound, all fiery oranges and blood reds bleeding into a pale, sickly lemon yellow. It's heavy, thick paint, almost like he used a palette knife to scar the sky." Clara closed her eyes, her head tilting as if she were listening to his words rather than trying to see the image. "And the ship?" "The Temeraire is a phantom," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's a pale, ghostly white being towed to its scrap heap by a small black steam tug. The tug is ugly and soot-colored, breathing out a trail of dark, dirty smoke that cuts right through that glorious sunset. It's the old world of grace being dragged away by the new world of iron." "The smoke," Clara said, her fingers twitching at her side as if she were holding an invisible brush. "Is it just black?" "No," Elias said, leaning in. "It's a bruised charcoal. And right where the sun hits the soot, there's a fringe of deep, burnt umber. It's the color of a burnt matchstick." Clara let out a shaky breath. "I can see it. Not with my eyes, but the heat of it. The way you describe the scarring of the sky. I can feel the friction of the paint." They moved through the gallery like two conspirators. Elias became her eyes, but Clara in return became his heart. She asked him about the texture of the clouds in a constable, the smell of the damp earth in a Gainsborough, and the weight of the velvet in a portrait of a duchess. By the time they reached the Impressionist wing, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long slanted shadows across the polished floors. "Elias," she said suddenly, stopping in front of a Monet. "The room was quieter here. Why are you doing this? You're a man who hides in a basement with dead poets." Why come out into the light for me? Elias looked at her. The light from the skylight caught the gold in her hair, turning the messy strands into a halo of spun wire. He got about the letters. He got about the way his shop felt like a tomb until she had tumbled into it. Because, he said, the honesty hitting him with the force of a physical blow. I've spent 15 years preserving the past because I was afraid of the present. I thought stories were safer when they were bound in leather. But you're a story that's still being written, Clara. And I find I'm very interested in the next chapter. Clara reached out. This time her hand didn't miss. Her fingers grazed his jaw, her touch light and curious, tracing the line of his cheekbone up to his temple. You're very solid, she whispered, her thumb brushing the corner of his mouth. And you smell like vanilla and old secrets. The air between them charged a silent hum that rivaled the energy of the paintings on the walls. For a moment, the gallery disappeared. There was no blurring vision, no ancient books, no ticking clocks. There was only the heat of her hand and the steady grounding rhythm of his heart. Then, the loud rhythmic whack, whack, whack of a security guard's shoes echoed down the hall. Clara pulled her hand back, a blush creeping up her neck, mirroring the sunset they had just described. We should probably go, she said, a small, shy smile playing on her lips. Before they charge us for extrasensory loitering. As they walked toward the exit, the sun hit a stained glass window near the door, throwing a splash of brilliant kaleidoscopic light across the floor. Clara stopped. She didn't squint. She didn't turn away. She just stood in the center of the colors, bathed in blues and magentas. Elias. Yes. Tomorrow. I want to paint you. Not the suit. Not the librarian. I want to paint the man who sees bruised charcoal in the smoke. Chapter 4, The Ghost in the Ink. The walk back to the Vellum Vault was punctuated by the rhythmic tap of Clara's boots and the comfortable silence of two people who had just shared a world. Elias felt a lightness he hadn't known in years, a sense of purpose that transcended the restoration of old paper. When they reached the shop, the closed sign was still turned outward, the gold lettering glinting in the twilight. I'll leave you here, Clara said, her hand lingering on the brass door handle. I need to get to the studio and prep. My hands are itching to move. Tomorrow at 10. I'll be here, Elias promised. With the best coffee in Bloomsbury. He watched her walk toward the tube station, her mustard yellow coat a bright beacon, until she disappeared into the crowd. Only then did he descend the stairs into his sanctuary. The shop felt different now. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. Elias returned to his workbench to tidy up, but his eyes fell on the Byron. He had returned the letters he found, or so he got. As he moved the book to place it in the heavy oak cabinet, a final, tiny scrap of paper fluttered from between the very last page and the backboard. It was different from the others. The paper was cheaper, the ink a harsh, standard black ballpoint. And the handwriting wasn't Clara's. Clara, stop hiding in the dust. The Visions of the Void series belongs to the gallery, and by extension to me. I know about the eyes. I know you're running out of time. Don't make me come find you and remind you who owns the brushes you use. Julian. Elias felt a cold, sharp anger radiate from his chest. Owns the brushes. He muttered to the empty room. He looked at the date on the back of the scrap, just a week ago. This wasn't a memory, it was a threat. Elias sat at his desk, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He got of Clara's fierce independence, her defiance in the face of the encroaching dark. This Julian sounded like a predator, someone who saw her tragedy not as a loss, but as a marketing hook, a blind artist gimmick to be exploited before the lights went out for good. He spent the next hour doing what he did best, investigating. He went to his small computer in the back office and searched for Julian Vane. The results were instantaneous. Vane was a high-profile gallery owner known for discovering troubled geniuses. He was polished, ruthless, and currently promoting a Farewell to Light exhibition featuring Clara Vance. The marketing copy made Elias's stomach turn. Witness the final, frantic strokes of a genius before the eternal night. He had turned her heartbreak into a countdown clock. A sudden noise at the top of the stairs made Elias freeze. The bell didn't sigh this time, it rattled violently. Elias stood, sliding Julian's note into his pocket. He climbed the stairs and unlocked the door. Standing under the street lamp was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a luxury car advertisement. His coat was cashmere, his hair perfectly coiffed, and his expression was one of bored superiority. "I'm looking for a book," the man said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "A green Byron. I believe a distraught friend of mine might have dropped it off here." Elias didn't move. He stood in the doorway, blocking the path into his world. "The shop is closed, Mr. Vane." Julian's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping over Elias's ink-stained apron with a flicker of disdain. "So you know who I am. Good. Then you know that book contains intellectual property that belongs to the Vane Gallery. I'd like it back. Now." "I don't know anything about intellectual property," Elias said, his voice deceptively calm, the tone he used when dealing with fragile vellum. "I only know about preservation. And right now that book is under my protection." Julian took a step closer, his perfume something expensive and metallic clashing with the smell of the shop. "Don't be a hero, librarian. Clara is a sinking ship. I'm just trying to save the cargo. If you're smart, you'll stay out of the way of people who actually know what her work is worth." "I think," Elias said, stepping forward so they were chest to chest, "that you have no idea what anything is worth. You only know the price." Julian let out a short dry laugh. "We'll see. Tell her I'm coming for the canvases on Friday one way or another." He turned and disappeared into the London fog. Elias stood on the threshold for a long time, the cold air biting at his skin. He realized then that the slow burn was over. The world was moving faster than Clara's eyes could keep up with, and he was the only one holding the map. Elias didn't wait for morning. The weight of Julian's note in his pocket felt like a live coal. He grabbed his coat, locked the heavy iron gate of the vault, and hailed a cab. He had the address from his quick search, a converted warehouse in Shoreditch where the rent was high and the light was supposedly authentic. The taxi rattled through the city, but Elias barely saw the neon blur of London. He was thinking of Clara's hands, how they moved with such certainty when they touched the texture of the book, yet hesitated when reaching for a countertop. The warehouse was a hulking brick beast. He found her name on a tarnished brass buzzer, Studio 4B. He pressed it. "Yes." Her voice came through the intercom, sounding small and distorted. "It's Elias." There was a long pause, then the buzz of the door. Chapter 5, The Sanctuary of Splatter. The studio was a cathedral of chaos. It was a massive, open space with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, though most were covered with thick, black velvet drapes to control the glare. The air was thick with the scent of turpentine, espresso, and something metallic, the smell of old blood and new paint. Clara was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by a single powerful halogen lamp. She looked small against the backdrop of her massive canvases. "Elias." She squinted toward the door, shielding her eyes. "It's nearly midnight. Did the Byron catch fire?" "Julian Vane came to the shop," Elias said, skipping the pleasantries. He walked into the circle of light, holding out the scrap of paper. "I found this in the back of the book. And then he showed up at my door, claiming he owns your work." "Claiming he owns you?" Clara's posture shattered. The defiance she had carried in the National Gallery evaporated, leaving her looking fragile and exhausted. She sat down heavily on a paint-splattered stool, her hands trembling as she tucked them into her sleeves. "He doesn't own me," she whispered. "But he owns the contract I signed when I got the blurring was just stress. He paid for my materials, my rent, my doctors. In exchange, he gets the Visions of the Void series. The Blind Artist Collection." She looked up, her eyes wide and glassy. "He wants me to be a tragedy, Elias. He's already sold 3 pieces to collectors who are betting on my eyes failing completely. They're buying the last light before the dark." Elias felt a surge of protective fury. He looked at the canvases turned toward the wall. "Show me." "No, they're not finished." "Show me, Clara." With a shaky hand, she turned one of the large frames around. It was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. It wasn't the meticulous realism of the restorer's world. It was an explosion of raw, visceral emotion. Deep violets collided with searing streaks of gold, shapes were suggested rather than defined. It looked like a world seen through a prism of tears and fire. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. He wants these on Friday, Clara said, her voice cracking. But they aren't ready. I'm not ready to say goodbye to them. Elias walked up to the canvas. He didn't look at the art, he looked at the technique. He saw where her brush had faltered, where the peripherals she had written about had caused the colors to bleed off the edge of the intended shape. Then we don't give them to him, Elias said firmly. I have a contract, Elias. He has lawyers. I have a fading map, and a bank account that's empty. Elias turned back to her, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intelligence. The restorer in him was waking up, the man who knew how to hide things, how to alter surfaces, and how to make the new look old. He wants visions of the void. Elias asked, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. Then we'll give him exactly what he's looking for. But it won't be these. We're going to spend the next 48 hours making sure Julian Vane gets a masterpiece of a lie. Clara stared at him. You want to forge my own work? I want to protect the truth by creating a distraction, Elias said. You have the vision. I have the technical knowledge of pigments and chemistry. We're going to hide your heart, Clara. And we're going to do it in the one place he'll never look, right under his nose. The studio transformed from a place of mourning into a laboratory of defiance. Elias stripped off his charcoal suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded from years of handling heavy presses and delicate chemicals. If we're going to give him a void, Elias said, his voice dropping into the steady, authoritative tone of a master craftsman, we're going to give him something that looks like your style, but says absolutely nothing about your soul. We need to create the ghost of your talent. Chapter 6, The Alchemy of Midnight. The process was a frantic, beautiful dance of opposites. Clara provided the raw emotional energy, the what, and Elias provided the technical how. Elias took over the mixing table. He didn't just pour paint, he treated it like an archival restoration. He used his knowledge of refractive indices and pigment density to create colors that looked vibrant under the studio's halogen lights but would look muddy and flat in the natural light of Julian's gallery. Give me the bruised plum from your letter, Elias commanded, grinding a raw violet pigment into a binder. Clara stood before a fresh, massive canvas. She held her brush not like a tool, but like a weapon. It needs more gray, she said, her eyes narrowed as she stared at the palette. Like the color of the city just before it rains when the light is being squeezed out of the sky. Elias added a drop of Payne's gray and a hint of zinc white. Better. Perfect. For the next 6 hours, the only sounds were the scratching of bristles against canvas and the occasional clink of glass jars. Elias watched her work, mesmerized. Even with her narrowing vision, her muscle memory was flawless. She moved by instinct, sensing the edges of the frame by the stretch of her arm. But as the clock ticked toward 4 a.m., the exhaustion began to show. Clara's strokes grew erratic, and she accidentally knocked over a jar of linseed oil. The liquid spread across the floor like a golden stain. I can't see the edge of the table anymore, Elias, she whispered, her voice thick with fatigue and fear. It's all just shapes. I'm painting in a fog. Elias stepped behind her. He didn't take the brush. Instead, he placed his hands over hers, guiding her arm back to the center of the canvas. Then don't look at the canvas, he murmured against her hair. Look at the memory. Tell me about the first thing you ever loved the color of. My grandmother's garden, she said, her eyes closing as she leaned back into his warmth. She had these blue hydrangeas. Not just blue, they were the color of the air right after a thunderstorm. They felt cold to the touch. Paint that, Elias whispered. I'll be the borders. I'll tell you where the world ends. Guided by his touch, Clara began to paint with a new kind of freedom. She wasn't trying to fight the dark anymore, she was inviting him into it. Together, they created a series of decoy canvases, works that were technically brilliant, but lacked the hidden indigo ink secrets of her real heart. These were the visions of the void Julian wanted, dark, nihilistic, and marketable. By dawn, 3 large canvases stood drying near the heaters. They looked exactly like the work of a genius losing her way. He'll buy it, Clara said, looking at the blurred masterpieces. She wiped a smudge of Prussian blue from her cheek, looking up at Elias. He'll think he's won. He's won a shelf, Elias said, looking at the real canvases they had hidden under a heavy tarpaulin in the corner. The pearl is staying with us. He looked at her, then really looked at her, covered in paint, exhausted, and more beautiful than any first edition he had ever held. The slow burn had finally caught fire. The sun hadn't even fully cleared the jagged skyline of Shoreditch when the sharp rhythmic rapping of a cane echoed against the studio's metal door. It was Friday. He's early, Clara hissed, her voice tight with panic. She was still in her paint-stained smock, her eyes bloodshot from the 48-hour marathon. Elias looked at the real canvases. They were leaned against the far wall, partially covered by a thin, translucent sheet that did nothing to hide the vibrant, emotional truth of her work. If Julian saw those, the decoy plan was dead before it began. Hide them in the freight elevator, Elias whispered, grabbing a heavy wool blanket. I'll handle the door. Elias, if he sees you here. Go. Now. Chapter 7, The Art of the Stall. Elias didn't open the door immediately. He took a slow, deliberate breath, smoothing his wrinkled shirt and adjusting his glasses. He wanted to look like a man who belonged there, not a thief, but a guardian. When he finally pulled the heavy door back, Julian Vane was standing there, checking a gold watch. He looked immaculate, a sharp contrast to the grit and chemical tang of the studio. You again, Julian said, his lip curling. The librarian. I suppose Clara has expanded her collection of relics. I'm here as a consultant, Mr. Vane, Elias said, stepping into the doorway to block Julian's line of sight. Clara asked for my expertise on the chemical stability of the new series. We've been working through the night. Julian pushed past him anyway, his cane clicking sharply on the concrete. Working. Or wasting time. I have a transport team downstairs. The Void series needs to be in the climate-controlled van in 20 minutes. He scanned the room. The decoy canvases were front and center, their dark, nihilistic swirls of paint still glistening slightly. Julian walked up to the largest one, squinting through his designer frames. It's bleak, Julian murmured, a predatory smile touching his lips. Perfect. The critics will eat this up. The onset of total darkness translated to the canvas. It's tragic. It's expensive. From the shadows of the back hallway, Elias heard the faint clunk of the elevator gate. Julian's head snapped toward the sound. What was that? The pipes, Elias lied instantly. This building is as old as some of my books. The heating system is practically Victorian. Julian didn't look convinced. He began to walk toward the back of the studio, toward the area where the real canvases had been just moments before. Every step he took felt like a hammer blow to Elias's nerves. There's a strange energy in here, Thorne, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. A lot of activity for a woman who supposedly can't see the end of her own nose. Tell me, where is the Byron? I want to ensure the notes haven't been tampered with. The book is being kept in a humidity-controlled safe, Elias said, moving to intercept him. As per the terms of our consultation, it stays with the restorer until the project is finalized. Julian stopped, only inches from the heavy velvet curtain that led to the freight lift. He reached out with his cane, the silver tip hovering just near the fabric. You're very protective of her, aren't you? Julian asked, his eyes boring into Elias. But you're a man of history. You should know that eventually, everything ends up in the dark. Why fight it? Because Elias said, his voice steady and cold, some things are only visible when the lights are turned down. You're looking for a void, Julian. But you're missing the stars. Suddenly the intercom buzzed. Mr. Vane. The transport team is ready for the pickup. The distraction worked. Julian exhaled a sharp, impatient sound. He turned back toward the decoys. Fine. Wrap these up. I want them out of this hellhole and into the gallery by noon. And tell Clara. I expect her at the opening. In her best dress. Even if she has to be led there by the hand. As Julian walked out, trailing his metallic perfume behind him, Elias felt the air rush back into his lungs. He waited until the sound of the transport van faded into the London traffic before he walked to the back of the studio. He pulled back the curtain. Clara was there, slumped against the wood-paneled wall of the elevator, her hand clutching the frame of her true masterpiece, the one they had finished together. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for his face in the shadows. "Is he gone?" she whispered. "He's gone," Elias said, reaching out to help her up. "And he took the lies with him." Clara stood, leaning into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "He's going to find out eventually. When the critics look too closely. When he realizes the void is empty. By then," Elias said, kissing the top of her head, "you'll be halfway to Italy. I know a small villa in Tuscany where the light is so bright it practically sings. And the local library has a collection of 16th century manuscripts that desperately need a restorer who isn't afraid of a little color." Clara pulled back, faint genuine light returning to her eyes. "Italy. You'd leave your vault for that?" "The vault was a place to hide," Elias said, smiling. "I think I'd rather be somewhere I can see you." Epilogue: the warmth of burnt sienna. The hills of Tuscany didn't just have color, they had a pulse. 6 months had passed since the Great Deception of London. In the art world, Julian Vane was still reeling from the Void scandal. Critics had eventually realized the paintings were technically masterful but emotionally hollow, a hollow shell of Clara's true genius. By the time the lawsuits were filed, however, the artist in question had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a green leather book and a very confused landlord. In a small stone villa perched on the edge of a vineyard, the air smelled of rosemary and drying oil paint. Elias sat on the terrace, a stack of vellum sheets spread before him. He was no longer working in a basement. The Italian sun poured over his shoulders, illuminating the delicate work he was doing, restoring a local parish's choir book from 1540. But his eyes weren't on the Latin script. They were on the woman standing 20 feet away, near the edge of the olive grove. Clara wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a simple white dress. She didn't use an easel today. She stood before a large canvas tacked directly to the stone wall of the villa. "Elias," she called out, her voice bright and steady. "What color is the dust near the roots of the old oak? Don't just say brown." Elias stood up, walking over to her. He didn't lead her by the hand, she moved with a new kind of confidence, her feet knowing the terrain of their sanctuary by heart. Her vision was a narrow corridor now, a sliver of the world, but within that sliver, everything was vibrant. He stepped behind her, looking over her shoulder at the canvas. It was a masterpiece of light, not the fading light of a tragedy, but the rising light of a new language. "It's the color of an old cello," Elias said, leaning in. "A deep, resonant umber that's been polished by 100 years of music. And right where the sun hits it, there's a spark of raw sienna like a copper coin dropped in the dirt." Clara smiled, her brush unerringly finding the exact shade on her palette. "A copper coin. I can work with that." She painted a stroke of warmth onto the canvas. She was no longer painting for a gallery or a contract. She was painting for the man who had taught her that even when the eyes fail, the soul can still see in high definition. "I finished the Byron restoration today," Elias murmured, his hand resting on the small of her back. "I found one last note you'd tucked into the binding. One I missed in London." Clara paused, her brush hovering. "Oh. Which one was that?" Elias pulled a small, worn scrap of paper from his pocket. It was the very first one she had ever written, the one he had hidden under his blotter. "To whoever finds this, I hope you're looking for a different kind of poetry." "I found the poetry," Clara, Elias said, his voice thick with a quiet, enduring heat. "It wasn't in the book. It was in the way you look at a bruised plum sky and refuse to let it go." Clara turned in his arms, her eyes finding his not with perfect clarity, but with a focus that went deeper than optics. She reached up, her paint-stained fingers tracing the familiar lines of his face, a map she had memorized so well she could find her way home in total darkness. "The restorer and the artist," she whispered, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "The story and the light," he replied. Outside, the Tuscan sun began its slow descent, painting the hills in shades of gold, violet, and a deep, defiant crimson. It was a world of disappearing edges, but as they stood together in the fading glow, neither of them was afraid of the dark. The end.